strikes may be carried out on Moscow. And we would like these to be specific strikes, blackouts, but oddly enough, we're not even talking about Ukrainian drones, although they do reach there as well. Dugin, whom you now see on the screen, is a Kremlin ideologue, an absolutely crazed old man with completely insane, mad ideas. Ideas that not only border on fascism, honestly, I think they even go beyond it. He has even surpassed it a little bit. So, what is he saying this time, and what are they writing about? Russians don't want to fight, so the center of Moscow needs to be destroyed with missile strikes. That's what Dugin says. So he's disappointed that many Russians don't want to fight, and he believes that a serious shock is needed so that millions will go to the front. The more I look at Russians, the more disappointed I become. It would seem obvious we need victory in the war. And well, he says, in all the wars that Russia will wage in the coming decades, we absolutely need mobilization. Well, and here it should be added that it was actually Alexander Dugin who previously called for this mobilization. There are also some interesting facts about mobilization here, which I'll tell you about in a moment, but for now, let's finish with this. And a huge number of Russians don't want to fight, think they can shirk their duty, hope for some kind of negotiations, and worry about trivial things like, for example, the ban on Telegram. It's disgusting to watch all this, the philosopher said in a conversation with, according to some sources from certain Telegram channels. In this situation, in his opinion, there are two possible solutions. The first is a very harsh total mobilization of several million people in a very short period of time. Dugin asked Putin to urgently consider such an option. But there is another way out, says Kremlin ideologist Dugin. We have reached the point where a situation must arise, during which Russians will realize that they need to fight and that it is better to die at the front than to stay at home. Such a situation could be caused by devastating missile strikes on Moscow. Yes, there may be casualties, the Kremlin. God forbid, but even that is possible. Historic buildings, ordinary apartments, people on the streets. But such strikes would show everyone that it is necessary to fight. Sometimes I pray to God for such strikes to happen, Dugin admitted. And previously, he had specifically spoken about missile strikes on Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other major Russian cities, saying that such strikes could really motivate Russians. Last summer, he called on everyone to give up vacations and warned about strikes on Sochi and other seaside resorts. So it turns out the Kremlin was unpleasantly surprised by Dugin's words and said that this is not how things work and that we are a bit behind. And what else should you know about Dugin and his complete disorders with his brain system? It's that he called for Lenin to be removed from the mausoleum and to make room there for the real emperor, because Lenin is no longer the real one. They have supposedly a real one now. And this is also something you need to know and understand. What did I tell you? What did I promise to tell you about mobilization in Russia? So look, right now their resources are simply running out. And it's not just us talking about this now, not just our experts. For example, Michael Kaufman from the publication Foreign Affairs, he was actually summarizing, as I understand it, for the 4th anniversary, basically everything that's happening on the battlefield and everything that we have right now. And what does he say? He says that since 2024, Russian forces have been literally ground down at the front with no reinforcements coming in. And now the advantage in drones determines the initiative on the ground. And what's interesting, Putin has no other options but to either announce mobilization or increase payments. And many regions are indeed starting to increase payments for contracts with the Russian army. But what's interesting is that since the economy of the Russian Federation is already not in very good shape, I'm not going to make populist claims that it will collapse tomorrow, that everything will fall apart tomorrow. No, not tomorrow, but maybe the day after tomorrow. But seriously, it really is in bad shape. It's just not yet at a critical point. But if the sanctions remain in effect, and Trump has extended the sanctions against the Russian Federation for another year because of the war in Ukraine, we hope that this won't be the end of it and that the sanctions will actually be enforced. Then sooner or later, waging war will become very expensive for Putin. The cost of this war will be very high. Plus, the losses of the Russian Federation in January have surpassed all previous years. That is, if you compare it to the previous 4 years, these are the highest. And there is no way to replenish the army. There is nothing and no one to do it with. So what are they doing? They are increasing contract payments, but at the same time, in some regions, they are reducing payments for those killed. Previously, they had large contract payments, sign-on bonuses. If someone died at the front, the family would receive high compensation, which was quite significant for them. You could pay off all your mortgages, all your loans, and even get a new Lada. But now that's it. They want people to go and fight somehow, and if you die, well, you just die. They haven't completely canceled these payments, but they are reducing them. So this is also an important indicator that tells us the situation with their reserves is actually quite difficult. And here's an interesting point about the reserves. Why hasn't Putin announced the mobilization yet? They have about 2 million, if I'm not mistaken, of these actual reservists. Who are these reservists? They had this kind of story. They offered those who had served in the army and had a specific specialty, for example, artillerymen. They did this even before the war. They invited them for something like interviews and started giving them motivational speeches with incentives. They would say, well, sign up, join the reserve. If you're in the reserve, everything will be great for you. You'll receive some money on a regular basis. You just need to come for training a few times, refresh everything we taught you, and everything will be fine for you. And about 2 million people agreed to this arrangement. By the way, their monthly payments were small, just a few thousand rubles. And now Putin is counting on this reserve of about 2 million reservists. But the question is, how well is this reserve prepared? This reserve needs to be clothed, given shoes, and armed. The third point is, we don't know how much of this reserve actually remains, because remember when that so-called mobilization was announced, how the Russians fled, even in mountainous areas, they were putting chains on their wheels. They put on those chains and left in an organized convoy. So, we'll see. I'm keeping an eye on it, and tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I'll tell you all about it. I promised you an interesting insight about the negotiations. What happened and how it happened? First, let's start with this. Oleksiy Honcharenko, a member of Parliament of Ukraine, writes the following, an interesting insight from the negotiations in Geneva. There was a noticeable difference in the positions of Budanov and Arakamia, who were more inclined toward dialogue. On the other hand, Merov and Kyslytsya were more hardline. Regarding Zelensky's directives, and as we know, these directives are marked by particular strength and resilience, writes Oleksiy Honcharenko. And right away, another insight emerges, but this one comes from foreign journalists, whom I also listened to hear what they had to say. They say that Arakamia and Budanov met after the official negotiations with Medinsky. They held their meeting at the Intercontinental. It's a big, nice hotel. And of course, a number of journalists who were following the process were also staying at this hotel. And what do they say? They say that after the official part of the negotiations ended and the delegations left, after some time Medinsky arrived at the Intercontinental no longer in his official suit, without a tie, so to speak, and held some time, a few hours in this hotel. Then he himself confirmed that he spoke with the Ukrainian delegation, yes, off the record. And then what else happened? Peskov confirmed closed negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. In Switzerland, the locations of these negotiations are not being disclosed. Peskov referred to the head of the Russian delegation, Medinsky, who had previously stated that the negotiations were held in various formats. So we can assume, as they say, without any omissions, that a certain part of the negotiations did take place. But what does he say about these negotiations? Medinsky himself? The The negotiations were tough but businesslike. That is to say, notwithstanding all of these factors, many observers and experts are suggesting that one should not realistically expect any substantial progress to emerge from these negotiations. Because for now, the situation regarding Russia's plans remains unchanged. In other words, the Russians are not going to abandon their plans. In Donetsk region, in Luhansk region, and in general, as I understand it, across all of Ukraine. By the way, information has appeared from the commander of the National Guard, Pivnenko. He says that Ukraine will be able to fight for several more years, 100%, and will not give up any territories to the Russian Federation. That's if we're talking about certain concessions. Peskov also said that determining the next meeting place regarding Ukraine will depend on the analysis of what happened in Geneva. Meanwhile, the heads of European intelligence agencies doubt that the US will be able to reach a peace agreement as early as 2026. This was reported by Reuters. The heads of 5 European intelligence agencies told Reuters that Russia is not inclined to end the war quickly, and in their assessment, its strategic goals in Ukraine have not changed. The publication's sources also note that Moscow is using negotiations with the United States to seek sanctions relief and economic agreements, while no breakthrough was announced at the recent talks in Geneva, despite Donald Trump's optimistic statements that a deal is already quite close. Well, if we look closely at the actual outcome of those complex negotiations, from what we can officially state at this point, it aligns with what President Zelensky said and summarized in his recent address, namely that supposedly the military have reached an agreement, that is, on the issues of monitoring how everything might take place, but the political track still remains in a kind of suspended state for us.